The sound came from beneath the ice, a metallic groan that hadn't been heard in almost 70 years. In the frozen silence of the Svalbard archipelago, a Norwegian survey team brushed away the snow to reveal a corroded steel hatch. The markings were faint but unmistakable, a Soviet insignia, half erased by time. When they forced it open, the smell of rust and oil filled the air. Inside lay the remains of a forgotten world, sealed since the final days of the Cold War. Within weeks, experts would call it one of the most significant military discoveries of the century. A lost facility, a joint operation that never existed on paper, and a story buried deep beneath the Arctic frost. Chapter 1. Black Snow, the Forgotten Arctic Facility. Before the Cold War cast its long shadow, the Arctic was a place of mystery, untouched and endless. To the north, beyond the reach of cities and politics, glaciers carved their paths through centuries of silence. But by the late 1940s, that silence began to hum with engines, radar pulses, and the low crackle of encrypted transmissions. The world had just emerged from the most devastating conflict in human history, and yet, barely 5 years after the final bombs fell, the race to control the next weapon had already begun. The United States and the Soviet Union stood as mirror images of ambition and fear. The US tested nuclear devices in the desert heat of Nevada and on Pacific atolls. The Soviets detonated theirs beneath the grey skies of Kazakhstan. Each side built arsenals capable of ending civilization, all while claiming the moral high ground of defense. Behind speeches of peace, laboratories worked day and night, blending science with secrecy. Every breakthrough came with another layer of silence, another name erased from the record. Across the Atlantic, Europe was rebuilding itself brick by brick. Cities like Dresden, Warsaw, and Rotterdam stood as ghosts of what had been. Families rationed, children played among rubble, and the sky was still occasionally streaked by the vapor trails of reconnaissance planes. The Cold War wasn't fought with rifles and bayonets. It was waged in the quiet corridors of research facilities, on unmarked ships drifting through fog, and deep within frozen ground that few dared to enter. For scientists and soldiers alike, the Arctic represented both opportunity and isolation. Svalbard, an archipelago halfway between Norway and the North Pole, became a frontier of invisible warfare. Remote, sparsely populated, and politically delicate, it was a perfect canvas for experiments that no one would ever admit existed. It was said that in those years, some parts of the Arctic were never dark, not from the midnight sun, but from the glow of auroras bending around the magnetic instruments that watched them. In 1951, the Norwegian government quietly approved a series of cooperative meteorological research missions with their Western allies. Weather balloons, atmospheric sensors, radar mapping, all official, all harmless on paper. But hidden within the agreements were special clauses written in sterile diplomatic language. They authorized the construction of dual-purpose observation stations under joint jurisdiction. That phrase would later appear, barely legible, on declassified memos found inside a file marked Project Black Snow. For those who served at these stations, it was a posting to the edge of the world. Supplies came by ship once a month, messages by coded radio. The men stationed there, scientists, engineers, and soldiers, wrote in diaries about the wind that never stopped and the way metal froze to skin in seconds. They built their labs into the permafrost, carving tunnels beneath glaciers, installing radiation shields and antenna arrays that pointed toward the pole. No one outside the project knew what was being measured. Not even all the men inside it did. Officially, Black Snow was a study of high-altitude ionospheric reflection, the science behind radar signals and radio wave distortion. In truth, it was an attempt to use atomic trace materials to track Soviet missile tests through the upper atmosphere. The method was crude, dangerous, and entirely unauthorized by international law. Each sample release was a cloud of fine radioactive dust, invisible and drifting across polar skies, detected by instruments hundreds of miles away. If it worked, the West could see every Soviet launch before it reached full altitude. If it failed, the Arctic would bear the contamination for decades. The scientists involved were divided. Some believed they were securing peace through early warning. Others, physicists, mostly younger ones, understood the cost. In letters later recovered from a private estate in Tromsø, one technician wrote, "We are poisoning the wind to learn its secrets." That line was never meant for history books. It was meant for a conscience that could no longer sleep. Then, in 1957, everything stopped. Without warning, the outpost went silent. Norwegian records list a communications failure due to equipment loss. American dispatches refer to meteorological complications. Soviet monitoring stations detected a brief radiation spike over the Barents Sea, then nothing. Within weeks, the site was erased from supply routes and removed from official charts. A new ice shelf, born from that same winter, slowly covered what remained. For decades, no one spoke of it. Those who knew were scattered. Some reassigned, others retired, a few quietly disappeared into classified departments. The Cold War moved on. Satellites replaced field experiments. The Arctic returned to silence. And beneath hundreds of feet of snow, the remnants of Project Black Snow froze in time, waiting for a new generation to uncover what had been left behind. When the discovery finally came in 2020, it was almost by accident. A Norwegian geological survey, mapping glacial retreat, detected unusual metallic readings deep within a previously uncharted ice ridge. Drones captured the faint outline of a man-made structure. By the time the team reached it, the storm season was closing in. They expected rusted pipes, maybe an old mining shaft. Instead, they found the sealed hatch, the faded Soviet emblem, and the eerie stillness of a forgotten Cold War frontier. As they broke through the ice, the temperature plunged. Their headlamps caught a tunnel leading downward, lined with frost-covered cables. A metal plaque, half buried in snow, read, Joint Research Site Aero 7A. Below it, a warning in Russian and English. Authorized personnel only. Strategic Research Command. The air inside was dense, heavy with decay and something else, something metallic that clung to the throat. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Instruments still sat on tables, their dials frozen mid-measurement. Papers lay scattered, ink smeared by condensation. The walls bore scorch marks, as if something had burned from within. In the far chamber, beneath a layer of ice, they found radiation shielding plates and fragments of glass tubes. The remnants of containment systems far more advanced than anything known to have existed at that latitude. One researcher, speaking off record, said it looked like a snapshot of the moment science and secrecy collided. Within hours, the site was sealed by Norwegian intelligence. Within days, American and Russian delegations arrived, separately, but almost simultaneously. Both denied knowledge of the facility, yet both insisted on custody of the artifacts. Whatever lay beneath the Arctic ice had survived the Cold War and was about to ignite a new one, this time fought not with armies, but with truths buried too deep for comfort. The rediscovery of black snow reopened old wounds, not just between nations, but within the very idea of progress. It reminded the world that the line between discovery and destruction is thinner than ice, and sometimes what we bury in pursuit of safety waits only for time to melt it free. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Cold Divide. The Second World War had ended with both triumph and trauma. The victors stood on opposite sides of a world split in two, their unity dissolving into suspicion. In 1945, as the last echoes of gunfire faded, the cities of Europe smoldered beneath grey skies. Rubble replaced neighbourhoods. Families were still counting the missing. But amid the ashes, the great powers were already preparing for the next contest. One not fought with armies on battlefields, but with information, ideology, and invisible weapons. The Soviet Union emerged from the war scarred but defiant. 20 million of its people were dead, yet its territory stretched farther than ever before. To Stalin, the sacrifices of war had earned the right to security, a buffer of loyal states, a wall of steel and silence between Moscow and the West. In speeches broadcast across the new Eastern Bloc, he warned of capitalist encirclement, of spies in every shadow. His generals nodded, his people obeyed, and behind closed doors, laboratories and secret cities began to rise, built for the next phase of survival. In Washington, the tone was no less severe. President Truman, briefed daily on Soviet expansion, declared that the world stood at a crossroads between freedom and tyranny. America's wartime allies were now potential adversaries. The Manhattan Project, which had ended the war in flame and radiation, was no longer a triumph. It was a target. The US military and its scientists turned their focus to defense, to understanding what might come from beyond the Iron Curtain. The Pentagon's new obsession was clear: intelligence. Who would know first if the other side struck? Who could see what no one else could? In those early years, technology and paranoia grew together. Jet engines screamed across test ranges in Nevada. Atomic submarines slipped beneath the waves, their patrol routes unmarked. Each nation sought to outthink the other, to predict movements, decode transmissions, anticipate catastrophe. The Arctic, once a frozen wasteland, became a crucial chessboard. Radar installations were built along the northern coasts, their antennas sweeping the sky for traces of bombers or missiles that might one day fly overhead. The air grew thick with radio noise, coded chatter bouncing between continents. Behind the official narratives of defense and science lay something deeper, a quiet race for dominance over the invisible. Scientists spoke of the ionosphere, the upper layer of the atmosphere that carried radio waves across the planet. Whoever controlled it could listen in on the world. Soviet physicists in Novosibirsk tested ways to bend radio frequencies over the horizon. American engineers at MIT experimented with early warning radar. But in basements and unmarked buildings, others began to push further, into the realm where radiation, magnetism, and atmosphere blurred together. These were not public projects. They carried names like Operation Argus, Project HARP, and eventually, Black Snow. The story of Black Snow began not in Norway, but in a conference room in Washington, D.C. in 1949. The attendees were few: 2 physicists, 1 Air Force general, and a civilian intelligence officer whose name was later redacted from every surviving memo. They met to discuss the feasibility of atmospheric tracking via radioactive trace release. The concept was simple: if reckless, to introduce microscopic amounts of isotopic dust into the upper atmosphere, then monitor how it dispersed. The data could reveal wind patterns at missile altitudes, giving early warning of Soviet launches. Officially, the idea was shelved. Unofficially, it was reassigned to a black-budget Arctic program under joint NATO oversight. The decision to build in Svalbard was strategic. The island sat almost exactly between the US and the Soviet Union, within range of both radar nets. Norway, small but geopolitically vital, agreed to lend logistical support in exchange for funding and future access to research results. It was a compromise no one would publicly admit. The official paperwork called it the FRU, Polar Atmosphere Research Cooperative, a name so harmless it drew no questions. But in classified cables, it was already being referred to by its operational codename, Black Snow. By 1952, construction had begun. Supplies arrived under the guise of weather equipment. Prefabricated metal corridors were lowered into newly drilled caverns. Power lines stretched across the ice, disappearing beneath the snow. The workers were told as little as possible. Their pay was generous, their contracts short. Once the tunnels were complete, they were shipped home and replaced by personnel cleared under the strictest NATO classification. Some were American scientists, others Norwegian engineers, and a few, curiously, were Soviet defectors working under assumed names. Everyone had a role. No one saw the full picture. Declassified fragments from that period describe a series of release tests. Small, controlled emissions of isotopic particles measured by radar reflection. The results were promising. The isotopes lingered in the atmosphere longer than expected, and their radiation signatures could be detected by distant instruments. But there were problems. The containment systems leaked. Readings fluctuated unpredictably. A technician's diary recovered decades later mentions headaches, nausea, and a constant metallic taste in the air. His final entry ends abruptly. Test delayed, instruments unstable, command ordered immediate shutdown. The politics around Black Snow grew darker as the tests continued. Soviet reconnaissance flights began appearing near the Arctic Circle, claiming to be weather missions. US officials, fearing exposure, insisted that all documentation refer to polar meteorology. Norwegian diplomats were caught between allies, pressured to explain why foreign aircraft were operating from their soil. A classified memo from 1954 records one frustrated official writing, "We've built a weapon we can't admit exists, on land we don't own, for a purpose no one will believe." Stalin's death in 1953 brought a brief, uneasy thaw, but with Nikita Khrushchev's rise, the rivalry reignited. Both nations began developing long-range delivery systems capable of reaching the poles. Intelligence analysts warned that the Arctic was now the shortest route between continents, and that whoever controlled its airspace controlled the future. Black Snow's research shifted accordingly. No longer about tracking atmospheric drift, it was now about detection, and perhaps deterrence. Experiments were planned to simulate nuclear detonations in the upper atmosphere using low-yield charges. The documentation ends there. Whether the tests occurred or not remains a mystery. For those who worked in that frozen outpost, the mission was both exhilarating and terrifying. The wind howled across the ice fields, turning metal into mirrors of frost. Radios crackled with distant static. Days blurred into nights that never truly fell. In letters never meant to be read, men wrote of isolation, of a feeling that the world beyond the Arctic had forgotten them. Some believed their work would prevent war, others felt it was the beginning of one. When the orders came to abandon the site in 1957, there was no ceremony, no farewell. Equipment was left running, lights still glowing faintly in the darkness as the last transport plane disappeared into cloud. Official records described the closure as a temporary suspension pending review. But as years turned into decades, the project was erased from memory, buried beneath the official histories of radar, space exploration, and nuclear deterrence. And yet, even in silence, the truth remained. A few scattered memos, a photograph of a snow-covered antenna, a letter home describing a place that hums beneath the ice. All fragments of a larger puzzle, the kind of history governments deny until the evidence becomes too loud to ignore. The seeds of that denial were planted here, in the years when nations looked to the sky and saw only enemies. Those echoes of the cold divide still linger today. In declassified archives, in satellite scans, and in the haunted eyes of those who once stood watch at the edge of the world. They remind us that every great power builds not just weapons, but secrets. And sometimes it's the secrets that survive the longest. Chapter 3. The silence beneath the storm. The wind on Svalbard never truly stops. It howls through valleys carved by centuries of ice, slamming against the steel ribs of the outpost buried below. In early 1957, that sound was constant, a living heartbeat above the men stationed at Site 07A. They worked by flickering light, wrapped in layers of wool and fatigue, the air thick with the smell of oil and ozone. Above them, the surface blizzard raged. Below, machines hummed in quiet defiance of nature itself. The world beyond their radio towers might as well have been another planet. Inside the facility, the temperature held steady at -5 degrees Celsius. Frost crept along the walls, decorating pipes and cables in silver veins. A low mechanical drone filled the corridors. In the command room, a half-dozen men gathered around a radar console, their breath visible in the cold. The red sweep of the scope illuminated their faces as they watched faint traces move across the screen. Isotopic markers released into the atmosphere hours earlier. Everything seemed routine, until it wasn't. At 300 hours, an alarm broke the stillness. The instruments spiked without warning, radiation readings climbing far beyond predicted levels. "System malfunction," one operator said, tapping the gauge. But the readings held. Then came another noise, low and unfamiliar. A rumbling that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The floor shuddered, dust drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere deep in the tunnels, a valve burst with a metallic crack that echoed like a rifle shot. Captain Erik Sørensen, the Norwegian commanding officer, ordered an immediate lockdown. Air seals engaged, doors slammed shut, and the facility's interior lights shifted to a red glow. He called for calm, his voice steady over the intercom. Maintain isolation, secure the test chamber. But within minutes, confusion overtook control. A pressure pipe ruptured in the containment wing, releasing a thin mist that shimmered in the emergency lights. One technician, standing too close, collapsed instantly. The others dragged him out, coughing, their gloves coated in frost and something darker. The logs recovered decades later record what happened next in terse language. Incident at Chamber 4. Containment breach. Initiated Protocol Delta. In reality, the men had no idea what Delta meant. The manuals were incomplete, and their radio contact with headquarters had been severed hours earlier by the storm. All they could do was seal the lower levels and pray the systems would stabilize. They didn't. By dawn, 2 men were dead. The surviving crew gathered in the upper mess hall, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the steel hatch. Inside, the air crackled with static and fear. Sørensen tried to send a distress call, but every frequency returned the same faint whisper, their own signal. bouncing endlessly between atmospheric layers distorted by radiation. They were cut off, alone in the storm, surrounded by ice and silence. In the test chamber below, something continued to hum, not loudly but with a strange rhythm, almost alive. The instruments, left unattended, recorded fluctuating bursts of energy radiating from the containment cell. Whatever had been released was still active, reacting with the surrounding metals and ice. Later analysis would show traces of xenon isotopes mixed with experimental tracer elements, a combination that should have decayed within hours. But for days, the readings persisted, as if the Arctic air itself had absorbed their signature. The men argued about what to do next. Some demanded evacuation. Others insisted on waiting for orders. No one wanted to face the flight across the frozen sea without navigation or clearance. They rationed food and melted snow for water, all while checking their dosimeters every hour. When one of them, a young American physicist named Hollis, discovered his badge had turned fully black, he said nothing. He simply went back to work, adjusting gauges with trembling hands. On the fifth day, a faint transmission broke through the static. A coded message from NATO command in Oslo. It contained only 3 words: secure and bury. Sørensen stared at it for a long time before replying with a single line: understood. What that order truly meant, no one outside the operation ever knew. But by nightfall, the men began to dismantle their own facility. They dragged heavy equipment into the lowest chambers and sealed the entrances with concrete. Radiation suits, now torn and useless, were thrown into the tunnels. Documents were burned in steel drums, their ashes scattered across the snow that drifted through open vents. As the generators began to fail, the base sank into darkness. One by one, lights flickered out, leaving only the dull blue of the Arctic twilight filtering through cracks in the ice. The final entry in the recovered log reads: primary hatch sealed, instruments disabled. No further contact. May God forgive us. It was signed simply, ES, presumed to be Sørensen himself. What happened after that remains a mystery. A Norwegian supply vessel dispatched weeks later reported no sign of life, only collapsed snow bridges and faint radiation anomalies in the air. The official explanation was a meteorological accident. The base was listed as decommissioned, its coordinates classified. Within a few seasons, new ice covered the site completely. For nearly 70 years, it slept beneath the snow, undisturbed, untouched, its secrets locked away by cold and silence. When the 2020 expedition unearthed the hatch, the world saw only the aftermath: corroded panels, frozen tools, and, in one sealed compartment, a small notebook preserved by the ice. Its final pages described the storm, the breach, and a line that sent chills through every historian who read it. The snow is falling black again. Those words gave the project its name, Black Snow, and turned a forgotten cold war myth into a chilling reality. What began as an experiment in detection had ended as a disaster erased by time. The ice had kept its secret well, but like all things buried in the name of progress, it eventually returned, carried on the wind, whispered through the cracks of history, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. And as the Arctic thawed, so too did the silence. In the distance, the sea moaned against melting cliffs, echoing the ghosts of men who had watched the sky for signals and found only their own reflections in the storm. Chapter 4: The Frozen Aftermath. When the first research team reopened the hatch in 2020, the world had long moved on. The Cold War had ended, empires had collapsed, and the Arctic had become a frontier for oil, climate science, and fragile diplomacy. Yet as the drill bit cut through permafrost and the old steel doors gave way, it felt as if history itself exhaled, a long-held breath of secrets finally escaping. The stale air that drifted out was heavy, tinged with the scent of rust and something else. Something chemical, faintly metallic, like memory corroded by time. The facility was intact in places, preserved by the ice. Workbenches stood frozen mid-motion, tools still scattered where they'd been left. Coffee cups, cracked but unbroken, sat beside notebooks filled with indecipherable shorthand. Every object told a story of men who had expected to return, and never did. As forensic teams descended, their lights reflected off the frost-covered machinery, illuminating a world paused in its final moment. They found the containment chamber first, a circular vault lined with lead plates and shielded glass. Inside were fragments of metal tubing fused together by heat. Instruments, though primitive by modern standards, still bore warning symbols recognizable today. Radiation, biohazard, restricted. The readings were low, but present. Proof that something had once burned here, deep beneath the Arctic surface. A Norwegian scientist, her voice steady but strained, whispered into her recorder, "It's not a research lab. It's a burial." As word spread, governments reacted swiftly. Norway invoked national security protocols. Russia denied involvement. The United States offered technical assistance, then quietly withdrew when the documents found inside began to surface online. Documents stamped with both NATO and Soviet seals. For the first time in decades, diplomats scrambled to explain a joint operation that officially had never existed. Press conferences spoke of meteorological cooperation, of historic misinterpretation. But the photographs told a different story. Radiation markers, containment schematics, and one haunting inscription etched into a steel panel. To see the unseen. The human element of the discovery emerged slowly. Among the artifacts were letters sealed in wax, recovered from a corroded locker. Translated and dated February 1957, they were addressed to families in Oslo, London, and Washington. Some never delivered. One read, "Tell them we kept watch. Tell them we saw the sky change." The handwriting shook as if written in cold and fear. Each letter ended the same way, unsigned. For survivors' families, the revelation was both vindication and grief reborn. A few descendants came forward, holding faded photographs of fathers and grandfathers who'd vanished without explanation. Officially, their records listed aviation accidents or classified service. Now they knew the truth, or at least the shadow of it. One elderly woman interviewed in Tromsø said softly, "He wrote once about snow that burned his hands. I thought he meant frostbite." Meanwhile, scientists analyzing the recovered data found anomalies that defied expectation. The isotopic traces left in the facility's instruments were unlike standard fission materials. Hybrid compounds designed for high-altitude persistence. They shouldn't have existed in 1957. Yet there they were, logged in notebooks, drawn in careful diagrams, accompanied by signatures of men whose names had been erased from every public archive. It suggested something unthinkable, that black snow had advanced far beyond what either side publicly admitted. The Cold War's technological frontier had been colder and deadlier than anyone imagined. In Oslo, the investigation turned political. A commission was formed, the kind designed to answer everything while revealing nothing. Testimonies were redacted, experts sworn to silence. Satellite images of Svalbard vanished from online databases for national defense reasons, but rumors persisted. A journalist obtained a single recovered reel of film showing the interior of the base. A blurred image of the containment chamber glowing faintly blue. He described it as the light of something that should never have been made. The deeper the inquiry went, the clearer it became that black snow was not an anomaly, but a pattern, part of a lineage of hidden science, stretching from post-war Japan's biological units to the radiation tests of the American Southwest. The difference was geography. The Arctic kept its dead well. Where deserts expose, ice conceals. And for 60 years, the snow had done its work, preserving what men had tried to forget. As winter returned to Svalbard, the site was sealed again, this time under international supervision. Thick lead panels were installed, radiation monitors embedded in the ice. The area became a restricted zone, its coordinates removed from public maps. Yet scientists continued to monitor it remotely, their instruments tracking fluctuations in temperature and radiation levels that, inexplicably, still shifted from time to time. Some claimed it was residual decay. Others whispered it was movement, pressure from something buried deeper still. For those who had walked its tunnels, the memory lingered. A geologist from the first team described waking at night to the sound of wind, but hearing beneath it a faint mechanical hum, like a generator still running. She said it was probably her imagination, the mind replaying echoes of what it had seen. But when she returned home, every metal object in her luggage set off radiation detectors at the airport. In the years that followed, documentaries, reports, and online theories filled the void left by official silence. Some called black snow an abandoned weapons lab, others, an early nuclear detection experiment gone wrong. The The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, where science meets secrecy and morality blurs beneath the weight of national security. For the families, closure remained elusive. The graves were empty, the names classified. What they received instead were apologies wrapped in bureaucracy, acknowledgements of historical oversight. But history is not an oversight. It is a wound that never fully freezes. By 2025, the site had become a case study in government secrecy, a lesson taught quietly in universities and defense academies. Students learned of isotopic drift, of post-war paranoia, of the thin line between defense and destruction. Yet what haunted those who visited the recovered archives most was not the science, but the silence, the absence of voices, the realization that the men who built Black Snow were not villains, but patriots, caught in a storm of their own making. Outside, the Arctic continues to melt. Glaciers retreat, revealing bones of ships, relics, and forgotten posts once buried under decades of ice. Somewhere beneath it all, the remnants of Project Black Snow still rest, sealed, silent, waiting. Nature, indifferent as ever, will decide when it is time to speak again. In the end, the snow covers everything. The guilt, the ambition, the names, and yet, for those who stood in that frozen corridor and saw their breath mix with the ghosts of another century, one truth remains impossible to bury. The past never disappears. It only waits for the thaw. Chapter 5, Shadows in the Melt. The Arctic never forgets. Every layer of ice is a page of memory, compressed, silent, waiting to be read. As the 21st century unfolds and the glaciers retreat, those pages begin to open. What once was buried beneath frost now gleams under the pale northern sun. And with each revelation comes a question the modern world can't seem to answer. How much of our peace was built on things we were never meant to know? Project Black Snow is no longer just a story of Cold War secrecy. It has become a mirror. It reflects the ambition and fear that defined an era, and perhaps still defines us. In the 1950s, nations justified every experiment in the name of security. The scientists called it progress. The generals called it deterrence. But what it truly was a gamble, a wager that knowledge without restraint could keep the world safe by staying hidden. Today, we live in the world they created, one shaped by those unseen choices. The technology born from those frozen experiments now guides satellites, communications, even climate research. The same atmospheric studies that once poisoned the sky now predict our storms. Yet beneath every innovation lies a ghost of its origin, a reminder that discovery often begins with denial. When the final classified files of Black Snow were released in fragments, they revealed something chillingly human. Not a conspiracy of monsters, but a network of ordinary people, scientists, engineers, soldiers, each convinced they were doing what was necessary. Letters spoke of isolation, of duty, of homesickness. Some prayed for forgiveness, others for success. Most simply wanted to return home. They didn't. Their names remain redacted, their remains never recovered. They are the invisible cost of secrecy and history's forgotten witnesses. The governments involved have since expressed regret. But regret is not the same as accountability. The radiation still lingers beneath the ice, the contamination spreading slowly through meltwater streams. Climate change has become the new unmasking agent of the past, exposing what decades of censorship buried. Every spring thaw reveals another trace, a rusted instrument, a stamped insignia, a notebook frozen to the rock. Each discovery pulls another thread from the fabric of the official story. In interviews recorded for the most recent investigation, surviving experts, now in their 80s, spoke cautiously. One American physicist, his voice trembling, said, "We thought we were saving lives by understanding how to detect the enemy first, but in truth, we were just afraid." His words echo the same sentiment heard across generations of warfare. Fear dressed as science, morality traded for control. Modern historians describe Black Snow as a warning in retrospect. It demonstrates how quickly necessity can erode ethics, how easily cooperation turns into concealment. In the pursuit of safety, entire nations learn to keep secrets even from themselves. And when the ice finally broke open, it wasn't the technology that frightened people most. It was the realization that those decisions had never truly stopped. Standing above the excavation site today, the air hums faintly with the sound of modern generators. A Norwegian flag flutters beside a weathered sign reading Environmental Restoration Zone. The sea laps at the shore below, carving away pieces of ice that have hidden history longer than most lifetimes. The researchers here don't speak loudly. They work quietly, taking samples, collecting data, documenting everything that the snow once kept. And yet, every so often, when the wind drops and the world falls still, someone swears they can hear it. That same low hum that haunted the men of 1957. Maybe it's the machinery. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's simply the sound of the Arctic reminding us that nothing buried stays that way forever. The lessons of black snow stretch beyond its frozen grave. They live in every debate about surveillance, weaponization, and scientific responsibility. They whisper to us from classified files and declassified apologies. They remind us that progress without conscience always leaves a mark, not always visible, but always there. In the end, history is not a record of what we did right. It is the sum of what we chose to hide. The Arctic holds that truth beneath its melting crust, patient, unjudging, eternal. As the last light fades over Svalbard's horizon, the ice gleams like glass, reflecting a world still learning how to live with its secrets. The snow falls again. Softer now, cleaner perhaps, but still cold. It covers the scars of men who believed they could command the heavens and the silence of those who followed orders too faithfully. And as it settles, a thought lingers in the quiet northern air. Some things are never truly lost. They are only waiting for the thaw,